Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start this session now, and it brings me great pleasure to have for our first keynote session at DACA Data Art for Climate Action Conference 2022. We have the first keynote. It's Moritz Stefaner, and I will say a few words about him and then let him speak much in great detail about his work on visual rhetorics. Now, Moritz Stefaner he's an independent designer and artist and a consultant on data visualization in many different contexts. He's based in Germany, northern Germany, near Bremen. He has an impressive portfolio of commissioned data visualization works, and I think one of the most recent one is called the IMF dashboard. I hope my German pronunciation of the word dashboard
spot on.
is okay. And that is nothing less than the official COVID-19 vaccination status in Germany by the German Health Ministry. And it's an interesting write-up there where Moritz explains what the particular challenges was in that kind of a project. Another previous project that catches one's eye is called Multiplicity, which was a commission from the city of Paris in France, where he, together with AI tools, went through millions of public domain photography of the city of Paris and chose a sort of small sample of 25,000 images, which is of course huge, and making an installation out of this where the AI was categorizing and finding similarities and variations of small nuances within within similar photography. Very evoking an interesting project. The first one that I saw of Moritz Stefaner was his work with Scientific American, which I believe he has done in more than one occasion, doing the infographics for Scientific American, and that one was on bees specifically. He is the winner and awardee of numerous awards to highlight the gold winner of the 2019 National Geographic Innovation Challenge, together with a team of collaborators for a data sculpture, a physical sculpture made of ocean plastics and built to the height of 15 meters.
The co-designer Sky Moray is in the audience here. I see her little.
Oh, great! That's fantastic. Yeah. And also numerous awards at the Information is Beautiful yearly contest. I think you clocked up something like 11 awards in much fewer than 11 years. So that's quite something. And he's a sought-after keynote speaker at events. So we are really very happy here at DACA to welcome Moritz Stefaner as a keynote. So give him a round of physical or virtual applause, and we will ask him to speak.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the kind introduction and reception. I see all the emoji claps. Very nice. It's almost like being on stage. So yeah, wonderful. We can skip the introduction basically and jump right in. As you've heard, I'm working in data visualization for all kinds of different clients and contexts, and the topics of climate visualization and public health visualization have been really important and very close to my heart in the last few years, and I hope to do more work in these super important areas. And yeah, as you can see, I've done all kinds of different experimental but also very applied projects. And today I want to talk a bit about and that is also a designer's, probably more than an artist's, perspective on what it means to design with data and to design with climate data specifically. So I looked a bit into the history of climate communication, and science communication in general is like something I'm really interested in. And for climate, I was surprised to see that we saw the first link between carbon dioxide levels and global temperature already mentioned in 1956. In the New York Times. So it seems to be an older topic, maybe in some circles that we were aware. There's no visual yet, right? But I think starting from the 80s, talking about climate has always been very strongly linked with data visuals. We can see here the front page of the New York Times in 1988 that already shows one of the classic climate charts, the temperature anomaly, comparing current median mean temperatures with a past comparison period, like here 1950s or 1980s average. And again, that's 1988, so it's quite a while ago already. By the mid 2000s, basically this curve had to be navigated with a scissor lift, as demonstrated famously by Al Gore, although this is the CO2 levels, obviously not the temperature, but we can see already we started to be in need of some sort of escalation in language, right? And I think Al Gore does that beautifully by introducing this physical device. But I think we've seen it in all levels that if you look, for instance, at these maps, these choropleth maps showing temperature change, that we feel these escalating color schemes, we cannot escalate more and more, right? Like how much more red can you become on these maps if the temperatures rise and rise and the projections get worse and worse? And I think there's a fundamental challenge here in the sense that we're trying to visually capture something that's maybe uncapturable and goes beyond traditional categories of what we can express in graphics. It was quite striking to see there was this brutal cold polar vortex a few years ago in the US. And when they reported on it in the news, the color scale just went transparent because they did not anticipate that it could become that cold in Minneapolis and Chicago. And so it's a very striking demonstration of this lack of language to express the new climate normal within traditional color scales, I think. And not only if we talk about data graphics, but also just visual illustrations, visual metaphors. If you run, for instance, a Google image search, this was a few years ago, but it's still very similar, just for climate change, it just reveals this shocking lack of imagination and the same old cliches being repeated over and over. And I think we just don't have a good visual vocabulary to talk about climate change and its effects. And so it's sort of a premise for me that we seem to be running out of colors and metaphors and images and have to declare certain visual bankruptcy almost in terms of visual climate communication. And that's bad because if we run out of language, we can talk about it properly, or we don't reach people maybe anymore if we run out of options there. And it's kind of funny, it's like in 2018, when the IPCC's 1.5 degrees special report came out, I talked to Angela Morelli and Tom Johnson, who designed the graphics for that one. And I think they did a beautiful job. It's really well-crafted graphics. But at the same time, they were very like serious and very scientific and very exact. But also in the end, by being so exact, very like tame in a way, not a striking visual. I was like, we really need more iconic climate visualizations, right? Otherwise we won't get through to people. And the funny thing is, like, just a few months later, the universe somehow delivered, or Ed Hawkins in that case, exactly that. It's like the perfect logo for the climate movement are the warming stripes, obviously, and they become this huge pop culture success, I would say. So maybe the climate movement is the first movement that has a data-driven visual identity through this sort of stroke of genius by Ed Hawkins. And I think that was sort of interesting to see that exactly this gap of, oh, we need an iconic visual that everybody knows and that we can use to refer to climate change as such. And yeah, he created that. And I think that's been a huge achievement and a huge step forward. And now we see it has become a meme, basically. It's getting remixed, reused. It has become this sort of staple of popular climate communication. It's also used in one of my favorite climate graphics, which is this one by Sustancio. And what they did is they took the warming stripes horizontal, so that's the global temperature anomaly, as you all know probably. And then they combined that with the curve of the CO2 emissions or the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is like straight going up. And then juxtapose that with all the major climate conferences and agreements. And I think if there is a quintessential climate visual right now, maybe it's this one, because it's bringing together these really iconic data graphics with at the same time this extremely striking lack of correlation between the agreements and the physically observable world. And so maybe if there's a quintessential database right now, it seems to me it's maybe this. And what's so interesting is this one managed, like the warming stripes managed to transcend the whole genre of chart towards becoming an icon or a symbol or a logo. So it's sort of not even a diagram anymore, but it's really has become this symbolic representation for a whole complex thing. That being the case, what it doesn't do is actually visualize climate change, right? It's just a symbol for climate change. It's actually nothing more. Also, because it shows this really so simple and really one-dimensional, like literally one-dimensional indicator, that's the global temperature anomaly, right? But that doesn't tell us actually what climate change is, what effects it will have, or what it will be like in any form, right? And I think that's the big challenge. And we can create symbols all we want, but it's really terribly hard to actually visualize climate change. So key question is, can climate change be visualized at all? And if so, how, right? How would that look? And I think that's why we're all here. I'm sort of afraid that there's a negative answer, that probably climate change as a whole will never be possible to visualize or even capture. And maybe that's really the first important insight, that the whole question of how can we visualize climate change as such is probably nonsensical or intractable. And Timothy Morton, great philosopher, he came up with this notion of hyper-objects, which really, for me, helped to untangle a bit why it's so difficult to even get started in working with climate data or get started in developing design ideas. And it has a lot to do with this huge helplessness that's just surrounding that topic, because the topic is itself so large and so complicated and so amorphous and so stretched out over space and time and layers of society and nature that's literally ungraspable. So it's and that's what Timothy Norton calls hyper-objects, things that have such a vast temporal and spatial dimension that it just defeats any thinking. You know, it sort of kills all of our rational thinking capabilities because it's too huge. It's just out of our league, sort of. And that's a very depressing thought, sort of, but it's also in a way a very liberating one, because we can just give up handling it as a whole. I think that can also, or for me personally, it was an important insight that, okay, it doesn't make sense to talk about it as a whole. Let's not do it. Let's focus on slices or perspectives on that hyper object, because the thing as such, as Timothy Morton puts it so beautifully, puts unbearable strains on our normal ways of reasoning, right? So it's not just you, it's everybody who just cannot handle it. And I think that's important to acknowledge, because if we want solutions, we need to be realistic about what can be done at all, right? And so I think the other flip side to that is we actually need radically new ways of thinking and reasoning. If we cannot tackle the whole problem in a way that is a clear continuation of the past. I think we've tried that, and I don't think it actually works, right? And so I think that is another like clear observation, so that we need sort of radical shifts in terms of how we think and talk and reason about this thing at all. So yeah, that's just the starting point here and sort of a little preamble. And I'll show you just 3 different ways of how I try and deal with this unresolvable mess. And we'll see what works for you, what sticks. I think there's many truths to how this whole thing can be untangled. So the first thing I think I'm pursuing a lot, and that probably also a lot of you being here at the conference are striving towards, is just make abstract and also like in specifically ecological information much more tangible. Everything's so like far away and cold and distant if we just represent it as numbers. And I think a key question is often, how can we tie that back to everyday sensory rich experiences and maybe also get a bit of a non-rational, non-explicit, non-verbal grasp on things, right? And this is one thing I explored together with students here at the Hochschule für Künste, like the Arts Academy in Bremen, where I ran a course called Beyond Heatmaps. Like we literally wanted to go beyond the heat maps. And yeah, look into what are non-standard forms for data visualization around climate change. And I'll show you a bunch of outcomes there. So the first one is from Katja Striedelmeier, a student, and she made a sonification of the later or the earlier and earlier onset of the apple blossom every year, right? So every year there used to be one time of the year where the apples started to bloom, and now the past few years we could observe it became earlier and earlier in Germany even. And so she used this mechanical music box, it's a little Spieluhr, to turn this information into sound. So she took the date of the year and basically turned it into music. And you can quickly hear how it sounds like. And so this ascending sequence of notes is actually representing an early onset. So we debated a lot what's a good representation of becoming early in music. And if you encode the duration directly, maybe in the duration of pauses or musical notes, it's very hard to distinguish. So she made this decision to use the pitch and the ascending pitch. And what I love about this approach a lot is that, as you can see, the physical way the sound is made, right, with these little holes and the pins, is in itself basically a diagram. You could read it as a diagram, right? It's a scatter plot, more or less, because time runs from left to right and the value is in the y-axis. And that same thing becomes something much more like differently experiential if you use that little apparatus. And you have this nice interplay, of course, between visuals and the actual object and the diagram itself. So it's a very direct way of visualizing a diagram one-to-one, more or less. Farina Hamann and Adrian Stecek, they visualized the shrinking Arctic ice, and they actually came up with the ice interface. So basically they built an interactive installation out of ice, and by touching the different extensions of the Arctic ice in different years, you were able to then sort of switch modes in the installation and look into this period of years specifically. So it's a selection process. At the same time, you're feeling the ice. So while talking about ice, you basically have ice in your hands, which is somewhat trivial, but in a way totally transforms the experience. And of course, the mere fact of using the installation made the ice melt. So it's sort of this feedback loop of human intervention, having this sort of negative effect, which is kind of cool. Then there was a group who took like the notion of hyperobjects very literal and looked very specifically, how can we talk about the experience of interacting with hyperobjects and that everything is interconnected and everything's multidimensional and nothing makes any sense, right? And so they made this sort of hyperobject data sculpture from different warped rabbit fences where there's different graphs and charts, and if the charts had a connection, they would also be physically connected inside. And so all the connections between the data set basically bend the final piece into shape, which is kind of beautiful. And it's sort of very on a metaphoric level, it's also a lot of the experience that we have to deal with when working with this multidimensional huge data sets, right? It's like this network and mesh and sort of trying to make sense out of really complex data constellations. There was a bigger story around it with the Wizard of Oz and 4 different storylines. It was like a wildly complex nonlinear piece, like a more artistic maybe even than the other ones, which are more design driven, I guess, in motivation. Yeah. One neat aspect about these sculptures also like the interplay then with the space. So this one also casts really beautiful shadows. If you think about projections and dimensionality reduction, right? So there's a lot you can think about also from a data processing point of view once you bring data into space. And this whole like angle of making things more tangible, more graspable, and also picking very specific sub-perspectives on data is also something we're exploring in the Data Cuisine workshops. So it's something I have been running together with Susanne Jaschko. And in these workshops, we explore the question if food can actually be a medium for information. And in order to find that out, we always team up with local chefs and local participants in different cities across the world. And we find local data and see if there's interesting local data stories we can tell using local food. So it's always a new experience depending on the place where we go. And usually we sort of cite interesting data sources first, or like, sort of hunt for different stories we could tell, and then sort of develop food and dish ideas around these stories. And then we actually try them out and cook them. And so, a lot goes into playing with food and experimenting, but also then arranging it nicely and making it a really composed experience. And at the end, there's always a big data dinner or a buffet where we all sort of then actually experience the visualization. So the idea is the visualization is not a photograph or a recipe, but it happens when you eat the food, right? And so the sensory experience could also be the taste or the temperature or the texture that actually visualizes something. So just to give you a few ideas of the outcomes. So here's a few examples. There were these atomic shots that show you how many people in Belgium live close to nuclear power plants. And the amount of these little bubbles there is proportional to the amount of people. And overall, like the whole vibe of the dish is, of course, very much inspired by the cooling rods in the nuclear power plants. So you have this feeling of actually drinking something really nuclear to some degree. This dish here from Boston investigated how far food has to travel to get to us. And so there was very like super local ingredients on the left-hand side and very like exotic, very far away ingredients on the right-hand side. And during the presentation of the food, the different foods were placed in proportional distance, so that tapioca banana leaf dessert was basically in the next room and you had to walk quite a bit to actually get there. So they were playing with this presentation situation. This dish here from Switzerland asked the question, when all the bees are gone, will maybe we have to do their job one day, right? There was this big bee colony collapse disorder, and so people were getting worried. So here in this one, you don't get a finished dish, but you have to sort of finish the pollinization part yourself. So it plays a bit with that idea of serving something unfinished if we sort of ruin nature too much. And this one's one of my favorite. It looks at the causes of death. And here the creator, Aline Bird, created one praline per participant, like a little chocolate casket, basically. And the fillings were representing the common causes of death in Belgium proportionally. So, and there was one for each participant, and the overall statistics matched the country statistics on causes of death. So it's a bit like a lottery in a sense that each participant gets one cause of death as a sort of the praline you get, and sort of a bit of a morbid, bittersweet experience, obviously, but again, a very tangible way to make probabilities and yeah, sort of these types of things more graspable. And yeah, I think all these approaches share a bit that it's very sensory, very like explicit experiences, very emotional experience, maybe even. And at the same time, they take very little slices of the data, right? It's never about visualizing huge data sets in their totality, but really finding one specific human angle and tying things to an everyday situation or an everyday experience or something that sticks mentally, right? And I think this idea of having really small data, but then presented in a deep way or interacted with it in a deep way is very promising, and also a very like general counter approach to all this. Oh, we have so much data and we can see the big patterns, right? But sort of tend to forget about the small human experiences around it. So yeah, it's always a great strategy to work like that. At the same time, I think it's not enough. And maybe as designers and artists, we're focusing too much on these fun, out of the box, crazy little things. And I think especially when we talk about climate, I think it's becoming clear that we don't really have an awareness problem of sorts, right? And my feeling is who wants to hear it has heard it by now, that there's something to be done. And so I wonder a bit if these general, oh, I'm just creating awareness for XYZ pieces are actually the right thing to do at this point, because I think we've played this through to some degree. And again, I think those who have heard are convinced already. And the other ones, I'm not sure if we can change their minds with fancy database desserts, basically. So maybe, this train has left the station to some degree. So the other things I'm thinking about a lot the last few years are actually more around building great tools and great communities of practice, and just enabling people who do important work to do it better, or to use data in better ways. And then you're much more, of course, in a much more applied mindset, a much more long-term mindset, and you don't have these flashy outcomes often. But I think in the long run, it can be much more powerful to some degree, or at least both needs to happen, right? And so, yeah, what I'm looking at is how can we enable people to do meaningful work in these spaces. So one project here is probably worth mentioning is Project Ukko. There was a collaboration with Future Everything and the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. It's been a few years ago already. But the idea was to make seasonal wind forecast data more accessible and put it to use, for instance, for companies running wind farms, right? And so it's kind of hard to predict wind well, and especially like how will the wind next winter be or something like this. It's actually tough because it's between weather and climate, and it's sort of difficult to do. But there were new models, and we wanted to make them more usable. And if you do that, the key to these types of projects is really understanding the data side of things and the user side of things alike, and really work with it in a creative way. And so in the beginning, we really tried to get a good grip on what people would want to draw out of the data and how they would want to use it. So we do a bit of brainstorming together and thinking about options, how this could fit into the existing workflows, or what new workflows could be established. And then sort of distill that into, hey, that's an architecture of an application that would actually work. Again, this is much more applied than sort of the data art side of things. The other part is really, and this is a side that I'm always interested in, is really understanding the data and the science behind it, and all the different things the data brings with it and can offer. And then I'm thinking a lot about what's a great visual vehicle for all that we've learned, right? And typically I'm looking for qualities like, is it unique? Is it intriguing? So, does it entice people to look closer? Is it expressive? Because I don't want to do super simplistic stuff, but really give an in-depth access to interesting phenomena. And is it elegant in the sense that it's resourceful, but also sort of a good overall construction? And in order to find these, it's often just a matter of exploring a lot and sort of seeing, well, if I plot it this way, what happens? What can you read better? What can you read worse? And in this specific project, the overall metaphor emerged because we knew we wanted to show a whole range of different future outcomes. And I think this whole idea of, there's multiple futures. How can we visualize future scenarios? And uncertainty around them is a big challenge in visualization and a big topic a lot of good people are working on now, but it's still not generally solved. And so we came up here in this project with this idea, or this general metaphor, that the future is a bit like a cone, in a sense that the past is to the left, if you're reading left to right. Then you have the present, which is the middle of this chart. And this is pretty much set, right? But then the future is a cone of different outcomes. So winds could be higher, winds could be lower. So it becomes from this point-like information towards something like a cone. And so we sort of transformed the scatter plot by a little bit of, geometric, moving things around and drawing the lines into the sort of cone that visualizes, or has as a metaphor this idea, okay, there's multiple future outcomes, and I can look at all of them from one point, basically, right? And that basic simple visualization idea basically became the vehicle for the whole project, because we said, well, if we visualize the predictions for one spot in the Earth like this, We could turn it into a more abstracted symbol on a map that is just one line that goes up or down, depending if we expect higher wind strengths or lower ones. And we can add more encoding, like the thickness of the line is now the absolute wind strength, not just the change. The opacity is how certain we are, so we can start to play with this visual language. And in the end, we developed this sort of really quite expressive visual language for people to explore this data set and be immediately drawn to the spots in the data where there's interesting patterns to be observed. So in a way, it's a very precise, but also a quite opinionated presentation in the sense that we bake into the design a few ideas of what people will be looking for and sort of guide them to the right spots, which is something I just like to do in general. And I think the nice thing about this project is also we developed this language and this general design approach to talk about this data, but then used it in a bunch of different outputs. So we had this web application and a video with some explanations, interactive exhibit, but also an ambient installation that sort of took that very design-oriented and very practical outcome into, again, a more experiential data experience. And so in this installation, we show all of the data we have. It's 51 different scenarios for future wind situations around the world. Basically, it's an ambient like loop that cycles through all these 51 different variations while slowly zooming in and out, like over 3 minutes. So it's very slow with this sort of a bit weird non-standard map projection. So it's something that's really, you can just meditate over and sort of feel at some point totally encompassed by this data set. And you can sort of swim to this sea of data, just sit and watch it. So it has this not very readable, but it has this real meditative quality to it. And enjoy it for a few seconds. And again, this idea to show multiple outcomes and sort of cycle through them is something that has become more popular over the last few years. Rather than showing big distributions, it seems much more effective to show multiple future scenarios and have people develop a sense of how probable these will be just by seeing how often certain things happen in these multiple scenarios. Seems to be a good way to deal with uncertainty in general. Yeah, so the interesting thing is, so this got a lot of attention from the design side of things. The question is always what happens afterwards, right? What are these projects actually good for? And in this one, it was continued to be developed like a software prototype, but then also actual tool for the scientists. As you can see, my original design vision wasn't quite preserved, right? But you can also see that it takes a bit more to build an actual working product than just a design sketch or the startings of a visual language. At the same time, I think, yeah, it's sort of clear you need to, if you want to have something to have a long-lasting vision, also from a design point of view, you need to stick around for a while. You can't just do a one-hit, hit and run job, but you really have to think about what's the full journey of getting something like this to actually to people. And again, that's something I'm much more interested by now, what the actual like end-to-end life cycle of our projects is, because as Kurt Vonnegut famously said, everybody wants to build, nobody wants to do maintenance. And I think that's a big problem, because if we all do one-off throwaway projects and nobody knows if they actually work in practice or what happens afterwards, what good is it? Or aren't we even at the worst, doing the same thing as any throwaway society does, but with our own creative output, right? So I'm sort of questioning sometimes how helpful these one-off stunts are really, and thinking more about how to build actual long-lasting systems. Pig spotting is one project where I'm doing that together with the German Railway. So we've been doing that for 4 or 5 years, actually continuing work on a very detailed and very powerful tool for them to use internally and to manage the train passenger loads in a better way. And there's a few more projects, maybe in half a year or a year, I can talk about 2 more of these long-term, very data-driven, user-centric projects that I think are designed to be sustainable from the get-go. And again, they take a bit longer and the output is often less visible in conference presentations, for instance, but I think they have a big value as well. So maybe next year, DACA, I can talk about this. So that's the second big direction: sustainable opinionated tools and data languages. The third part out of the hyperobject, or the third option to escape the hyperobject trap, maybe, is maybe getting closer to actually producing data yourself. So citizen science, or like self-made data, basically, moving upstream in the data creation chain. Because I think often as data artists, data designers, we take data as a given. Datum is, of course, the word for that. And don't understand really well where it comes from, how it was produced, and how it maybe could have been different if somebody else had done the measurement, right? And I think often these are the more interesting questions, even than how we can, if we make it red or blue, right? It's like, does it actually show the right thing, or could it show something else? Does it leave something out? And to get a better grasp on that, I think it's very helpful to create your own data. And so I do that again with bees. So you can see bees everywhere. I'm an avid hobby beekeeper. So these are some of my colonies there. And you can see one of them has a little black box with a wire. And that's actually like a sensor kit that comes from open source beehives. So they have a pre-made like sensor kit for beehives, and they also offer a little app so that you can track like some key statistics about your beehive, bee KPIs basically. And of course, I built a custom dashboard with that, so I can always monitor my beehive and see long-term trends in like temperature, humidity, pressure, wind speeds, you know, all the different things we could look at. And there's also a fun like little feature in the port sound from inside the beehive. And you can do like spectrum analysis on these sounds, so you can get a sense of what the constitution of the hive is, or if it's strong or weak, or if the queen is missing. They make specific, like the bees make noises at specific frequencies. And yeah, this open source beehive project also tries to classify the state of the beehive based on that sound recordings. And yeah, I was sort of curious to play with that, and also to understand like how across days, how does the temperature vary? So here in the inside temperature, it rises in the morning actually. So the bees do like, you know, sort of sleep at night, not really, but then in the morning when they all fly out, there's a big bump in temperature every morning. And that's earlier than the outside temperature, right? And so you can see all these different interesting patterns, humidity. One thing, if you have a personal relation to the data, so you know what it's about, you also have a good sense of the ground truth, and also if it's a good representation of reality at all, right? And I think that's so often missing, that if I want to judge if it's a good or bad data representation, and I have no idea, then it's also impossible to make a good design. So the closer you are to the data, the more you understand what's going on. And if you receive an email like this, the BuzzBox AI noticed this went missing queen, you're like, oh my God, I need to go there, right? And so I think it has a totally different sense of urgency, and also you can evaluate the quality of data and representations better if you know what it stands for, right? So that's worth exploring, generating your own data, and that automatically makes it also very local to wherever you live, and you have a different frame of reference. Grow Observatory, another project with Future Everything, goes in a similar direction, in the sense that we enabled farmers to have these little sensors in their in the soil, and that would constantly measure like moisture information, and that would be used to train moisture models better, but also at the same time give individual farmers back sort of these model results, so they understand at any time what the moisture situation in their soil is and how they could counteract and so on. So it's sort of, on the one hand, trying to generate a lot of good data based on citizen science, but also giving back immediately so people can make better farming decisions. So yeah, again, like building tools that do very local, very like specific stuff is sort of quite gratifying. And again, you can make totally different decisions if you have that direct contact to people, or if it's even for yourself. Yeah, so that's the big third part. Get closer, go more upstream to the data creation side of things. So these are the three strategies that sort of proved interesting to me. But old German proverb, there are many ways to slice a hyper object. And I think that's exactly the key, is we just need to find many different ways to look at all this. To me, it became more and more important to realize that if you just inform people about climate change, it just often means depressing them. That doesn't help anybody. And the question is often, how can you actually provide space for action and tools for action? And beyond understanding, and understanding is important too, but in the end, if you can't act on it, it can be very frustrating in the long run. And if you want to do more in that space, there's a great article by Brett Victor that lists a whole lot of different opportunities for being active in the space if you have like a technical or a design background that go beyond just doing this awareness type graphics or experiences. And so I can put that in the links in the chat later. The other thing is really data, and data viz alone won't fix it at all. So I'm not even clear what role we can play. And but the contribution we can make, or I think the perspective we can take here, is that generally, I think just making data legible is becoming less and less interesting because there's more and more better data tools, much more optimization. So I think this is becoming more and more an engineering task, right? So maybe a few years ago, it was good to have designers and artists to even just make data legible in some form, but I think we need to move beyond that. And I think there will always be great value in crafting rich and opinionated information experiences. So I think that will always be a thing. But the real value of really the contribution that design and art can make for science is sort of remix and reframe perspectives, and maybe also even instigate new research and new ways to look at what we are even doing, right? And that comes back to that idea, maybe we need radical paradigm shifts. And I think in order for that to happen, but that's a much more long-term perspective, is we need to have a seat at the table as creatives as well, because much too often the default assumption is science produces some data and knowledge and stuff, and then art or design communicates and transforms that, right? But I think this one-way street approach is just inherently like not making the best of both worlds. So I think if the information transfer could also go the other way, what happens then, right? Like, what if we put structures into place that actually enable that circle, right? But I think structurally we're often not quite there yet, so we need to work on that. But I think if it works out, it can be beautiful and can create magic. Sometimes it doesn't work, but that's fine too. But coming back to this point, I think not just thinking about how can we represent data better is one, like, not the only angle we should take, but really think more about also participatory experience. So I really like Rimini protocols work. So they do a lot of participatory experiences, installations. It's really not data visualization, but more creating social situations. And with respect to climate, they had this interesting World Climate Change Conference. And the idea was, as a participant, you randomly get assigned one country, and then you have to represent that country in negotiations around future climate targets. So you're sort of reenacting like the Paris, climate conference, but you have a specific agenda and a specific goal that you were briefed on. And suddenly you're in the shoes of the politicians making the decisions, right? And I think these types of like context switches and perspective flips can be really, really enriching and interesting, and can be much more memorable than reading about a statistic or reading an article about how the decision was made. The other thing is, I think what data can never give us is really these, or it's sort of hard to convey with data, is what are actually constructive narrative scenarios for the future. We can do that on, hey, this is an energy transition scenario that can work, right? But if we don't fill it with life and actually like a vision of how that would actually look like, I think it won't have as much traction. So I'm thinking about how can we combine these qualitative scenarios and visions with this quantitative stuff with actual qualitative future scenarios of future world, right? And solarpunk is interesting, I think, in a sense that they try to do that. And there's a few, bunch of groups doing these types of near future scenarios, but I think it's not done enough. The last part I got really curious about, but I haven't dived deep into, is the idea of games. So I think gaming is such a cool medium, and it is one where this idea of qualitative and quantitative future scenarios could come together beautifully. So there's one Twitter thread where I received a few pointers. So I'll post that too. And if you're interested in games, you can check that one out. Yeah, that's it from me. Two more links, where you can find my work and my podcast that I do together with Enrico Bertini. And yeah, we had a few climate folks there as well. So maybe interesting to follow. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you so much, Moritz. That was great. Very nice, very rich presentation of the history and other people's works that have inspired you, and then your own work, both the very official things and the very personal things, but your own beekeeping. So that's really very inspiring to hear from so many angles. So I want to open up to the floor, to the people here. I should stop sharing. I am okay. You were sharing. Okay, so are we good here? Yes, I'm wrestling a little bit with Zoom here, but it'll be okay in a second.
Yeah, it's the windows always disappear to somewhere.
Yeah.
I'll post some of the links I mentioned, and I can also post the slides later.
Yes, please do, if you don't mind doing that. And we will, we are recording this through the Zoom session, so the idea is to make it all available, of course, after the conference on our YouTube channel.
Great.
So yes, we have, I think, something in the, this is the links in the chat. So really open up to the floor. Anybody who is here in the session, please feel free to Q&A, Moritz.
So Sky asks, how comfortable are your students with climate data before they start their projects? So yeah, that was a big challenge, like with the art students, because it's, if you want to do something interesting in climate, it's a big hurdle is to get actually to work with climate data. And we had a bit of a head start because we got some really valuable input from another course that did all the work of identifying interesting data sets beforehand. But yeah, it's really tough because the data sets are so big and so like obscure often that automatically you have to do fairly simple sub-perspective or aggregated views, because the whole thing as a whole is again intractable if you're not a super expert. And yeah, I think my students struggled a lot with that part. But again, I think that calls again for actual art science collaborations that are more long-term and not just one-offs. I think it's the only way. Otherwise, it will always stay at a certain superficial level. There's another question: which software do we use or do I use in the design process? So a lot of the conceptual design is done in Miro these days because everybody's remote and we need a good environment for brainstorming and collecting ideas and sort of visually arranging stuff. So a lot of the visual research is in Miro. Then for the actual visual design or interaction design, we use Figma. Also because it's highly collaborative, and a lot of the actual data visuals are done directly in the browser. So I use D3 and Svelte as a JavaScript framework and just load data sets and see how they look and change the color and change the arrangement. So it's a very on the fly bootstrapping based code data design exploration, right? And then usually the main design output is like an interactive prototype, and then either people take that and rebuild it themselves, or I help them with the production side of things as well. Who should data art folks be collaborating with on the climate issue that they're not widely collaborating with at the moment? That's a great question. So I think for me, it has become more about finding different, like, again, moving away from just visualizing global indicators of climate change towards visualizing scenarios and what you can do in these future scenarios, like maybe what are different energy transition scenarios, right? And how could you calculate how many wind turbines you would need to meet a certain scenario? Like, doing much more like practical enablement of change than advocating for the wider general topic. And so I think literally anything that helps specific industries or specific political institutions make the right changes, I think is helpful. So anything more specific is already good. Should you even attempt to use data without including a domain expert in the process? That's a great question. So sometimes you see things as an expert and you say like, oh, they totally misunderstood that, right? And I think it can be a bit, there's always a risk that if you're out of your depth whenever you do design with somebody else's data. At the same time, I'm very used to that as a data visualization expert, you constantly work with different domains. And some things are, I think, universal. So if you have good general data literacy and good general data knowledge, a lot of the challenges and the codes people use or the structures people use are the same. So you get better at reading data infrastructure basically in the right way, regardless of domain. And then you're right, you should always have a domain expert, somehow involved. Often they don't need to do much, but just kick you off at the beginning towards the right direction and sort of check back if you make the right assumptions. So I would not be too scared of just starting a project in a domain you're not super familiar with, as long as you keep your eyes open and are self-critical and actually show people who have a bit of knowledge intermediate results and see if it makes sense. It's fine. It's as long as you're open in your process, I don't think there's a principal obstacle. Can I elaborate on some real life example of how to provide space and tools for understanding and action, not just impress people? So so the project Ukko was especially meant like that. So it was more like, not, well, the wind is unpredictable, but it will be bad in the future. But it's much more like, how will winds change exactly? And what does that mean for your wind farms, right? Which is a much more specific question. And again, we couldn't give definitive answers. So also in this user-centered design process, we learned we cannot actually say how the wind will change in many cases, but we could still give probabilities and show the range of different outcomes. And again, knowing that is better than knowing nothing at all. And so the idea is really to figure out a bit what are information needs people have and what are also big transformations we see coming and how can we help people navigate all that.
We're going to take one or two more questions before we end the Q&A. So go ahead. One more question from Sky Moret. How do you balance opinionated tools and science's aversion to opinion?
That's a tricky one because also in the Ukko project, the scientists themselves were not super keen on my whole opinionation thing. It's totally true. And you have to be sort of, so I think good communication always knows what's most important and what you want to center on and focus on. And I think good scientific communication does that too, right? A great paper has a great abstract, right? And I think if you can appeal to values like clarity and really getting things on point, you know, and that should be something that also scientists should be in favor of. But I think there's a very fine line in towards, is it activists? So many climate scientists, for instance, are sort of want to avoid coming across as activists because they might think that that might harm sort of their career or whatever. And so, and I'm aware that there's a very fine line between being on point and then being actually like quite opinionated or even activist in stance. And but like what I think in this dialogue, what helped me often is to try and get to the sense of, yeah, but what's a good visual abstract for the paper we have in the data, basically. But if we appeal to this idea that it's beautiful, or that there can be so much beauty and effectiveness and a good summary of something, I think if we can agree to that, then maybe it's already a better design, at least. Yeah.
Okay, one last question from our gathering. Okay, I have a question. I wanted to hear a little bit more about your approach to citizen science, basically how to get it off the ground. I mean, I guess it's also something that should grow from maybe a small group of people. I don't know if it's a class at university, or could it be some kind of top-down initiative to create citizen science?
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's a bunch of ways into this. So there's more and more open source projects or even companies that provide kits, like ready-made kits that make it very easy to get started. So either you buy the parts and just have to assemble them in a simple way, or even buy a finished product. And so it's still, the software is open source and everything, right? You can use it whatever you want, but it's sort of a very like easy way to get started without having to know how to solder stuff or, you know, Arduinos and whatnot. So I think there's a lot of and the B thing was exactly like that, right? So it was all prepared, it's super easy, and it makes an easy start. And there's a lot of initiatives around that. So there's Field Kit also, which is similar or more general, like sensor toolkit for normal people and so on. The other thing is often you can also observe and count yourself. So there's this beautiful book, Observe, Collect, Draw, from Stephanie Prusavec and Georgia Lupi, and that sort of walks you through a bunch of just observation and counting exercises and transform those into creative outputs. I mean, that's the most lo-fi thing you can do. Or right now I have a project running in my sort of backyard with long-term photography. So I made these, the technical term is solargraphy, or solargraphy probably. So you take beer cans and you put some photo paper inside and make a little hole, and you let it outside for half a year. And so basically it becomes a 6-month photograph of the course of the sun. And that's very, like, you know, easy to do, and can hopefully, I'll know it in summer, create beautiful diagrams of the paths of the sun and how much sun we got and how much clouds we had. So it's often a more finding simple inspiration around what can be done on this everyday basis, and then the actual execution is quite simple.
Okay. Thank you very much, Moritz Stefaner. It's been a pleasure to have you here as keynote at DACA, and we're all very inspired. And thank you for the good discussion here, many questions and from participants in this session. So thanks to everybody. Now I want to round this off and invite you to the next session, which is audiovisual artwork. And it's going to be in another Zoom session. And for convenience, this is posted in the chat, is the link to the next session. So the moment you click on that one, you're going to be like leaving this one and then going to the next one. If they ask for a password, it's the same as for this one, 2022-2, because this is the second day of the 4-day conference. Again, thanks to Moritz, and I will see you soon again.
Wonderful. Thanks all, and see you soon. There's a panel tomorrow. I'll be there.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Panel tomorrow.
If you want to see me again, yeah, just in case. Okay, bye bye.